right. Well, welcome back. Um, Yay! Online week 2 lecture. Pretty cool stuff, right? Um, so before I get into the meat and potatoes of today, just want to go over a few things for y'all. First, really appreciative for the folks helping me keep on task, letting me know when things aren't working when I think they are. Really helpful in the long run. So yeah, keep that up. Slowly getting through some of the homework and some of the forum posts, and really impressed with what a lot of you are writing. So just a couple things to always keep in mind with those. Keep professional grammar, respectful language, no cussing, anything like that. And when you're replying to others, make sure that you give something more than "I agree" or "I disagree." Make sure you're explaining why you agree with it or disagree with it, or share other reflections you got. Otherwise, keep up the good work and make sure that you're logging in at least every other day while we're in lockdown mode, if you can, or quarantine, stay at home, whatever phrasing you want to use with it. Um, but make sure that you're checking at least every other day for D2L, and if you're able to, make sure you log into your email daily. And that's not just for me. That's to keep tabs on your other classes, keep tabs on updates from the college itself. Most of those alerts and information is going to be relayed through your HCC email, so make sure you're logging into that and checking that. Um, and then with the forum posts again, just make sure you get your original post in by midnight of Thursday, and by 11:59 on Sunday that you have your replies to your other peers and your colleagues. Um, and yeah, with that, not sure how long this will take us today, but I do want to start with just a little bit of the trigger warning, the disclaimer of today. We're definitely going to be talking about focusing on maladaptive skills, specifically self harm, suicide. If those are things difficult for you, as you've gotten from emails from me in the past, and the update for the weekly, do know if that's not something you can handle, because I know we're all at different places in life. Do get in touch with me, and I can find an alternate assignment or discussion question for you to approach with. Okay? So, very important, do not push yourself too far if this is a topic too close to home for you. With that being said, again, this isn't going to replace medical advice. So, if you've got any thoughts or feelings about this and you feel the need to get checked out, go see your doctor, your therapist, psychiatrist, psychologist, or if it's an emergency, contact your crisis line, report to your nearest ER, or dial 911. Got it? Okay. So first things first is there's a little bit of a difference between suicide and self-harm. Suicide, there's a certain amount of seeking fatality, or the means are intended to cause a fatal outcome. Doesn't necessarily mean the individual always wants to die, but that's what the kind of the intent and the plan with the action itself is. It gets a little complicated, but we separate it out from self harm just so we can identify different behaviors and patterns, and lethality, and certain behavior approaches. So then, self harm, once again, not intended for death. Sometimes we refer to these as parasuicidal acts. And they can include things like cutting, burning, hitting yourself. That's one that you might see or have heard from others or parents of. Sometimes folks on the lower end of functioning with autism and other disabilities like that. Sometimes one of the way that they'll self-soothe and kind of cope when they get overloaded is hitting themselves. Or a person might hit their head or another body part on an inanimate object like a wall, a door, or may involve something like punching, the inanimate objects, that with the seeking of inflicting harm to self, not so much destruction of the property. Um, the And the other aspects we have here are things like pulling out hair, and there's a separate diagnosis for this. If that's like a primary thing for the individual, and there's nothing beyond the anxiety or depression or relief that the person gets from the hair pulling. If that's the primary concern, there's a diagnosis called trichotillomania, and that sits in the same in the DSM. That sits in the same chapter as obsessive compulsive disorders. Um, then there's another one that's a little related to that called excoriation disorder, and that's the one where people pick up their skin, scabs, other wounds, and sometimes can cause risk for infection, that kind of stuff. So that's excoriation. Hair pulling is trichotillomania. Um, you don't necessarily have to. I don't expect you to necessarily memorize these terms and be like, "Hey, I've had 5 seconds of hearing about this, and now I can diagnose it." Right? That's not the point to train you to do that. But if you go out into the world, or you hear on the media, or if you hear somebody trying to explain what's going on, and you hear a couple of those terms, just so you have a little bit of basis. Because those two tend to get thrown out a little bit more, especially nowadays that we have some better understanding of it. Other forms of self harm can include just pinching the skin, or just other actions that can be considered reckless or dangerous, with the intent to kind of um, create almost I don't want to say a rush, but to use as a coping mechanism where that sense of harm is kind of there. So that part, some of that stuff gets really complicated and messy when we try to decide, is that self harm or is that just a plain reckless behavior. Some of it has to do with the intent and motivation. Um, so obviously, again, that's not something you're necessarily with this class. You're only meant to get kind of that wellness, that very introductory mental health information, psychology information. So obviously not your job to try and figure that out for yourself or other people, but just to build a little awareness. So some examples of that can be something like even playing chicken, with the cars, or just other risky speeding and type of behaviors. Um, so once again, doesn't always intend. We wouldn't necessarily always classify that as self harm, but there is the potential just based on intent and motivation for what that person's seeking from the outcome. Um, Motivations themselves and outcomes are pretty varied and all over the place. Just like there's so many different forms of means to harm oneself, there is many different motivations and outcomes that people seek this out or utilize this for. And once again, self harm is a maladaptive coping skill. We respect that on some level a person is getting benefit from this. Now, it doesn't mean that that's healthy, right? But there is a purpose behind it. So at all times when we're examining self harm, we always want to look for what is the motivation and what is the benefit. So some of those motivations can even be simple as wanting to feel something different from what they're already feeling. Um, in the case of other people, it can be wanting to feel alive or feel any emotion at all, or even feel pain. Sometimes that happens when people experience symptoms of depersonalization, derealization, or like extreme anhedonia, inability to feel joy, or just lack of feeling, that kind of emptiness. Um, Things like certain expressions of like post traumatic stress disorder can cause a person to kind of withdraw. And once again, that's all over the place too. So there's always the possibility, but it's not a guarantee. So I always keep that in mind too as we talk about these reasonings and rationales and examples. But that just to be able to sense anything. And I've had a couple people in the past say that they literally weren't sure if they were alive or not, and that helps them feel alive. So it's a place to work with, right? Sometimes people are just plain curious about the feeling. Um, Sometimes, and I don't like this phrasing, um, but sometimes you hear about it being for attention, or attention seeking behavior, and that can happen. It's not something that we normally run up to people and be like, "Oh, you're faking it. You just want attention." Right? We don't view it that way, but rather maybe this person doesn't have healthy communication skills, or maybe they don't have an ability to express their needs, or to say, I'm feeling distressed or depressed, or maybe I don't know what I'm feeling, but it's not good, and I need some help, but I don't know how to express that or get that attention or help or in any way. So this is one way that maybe I notice that when I do this, I do get attention and people do help me. So that kind of in that instance, we'd look at kind of that building up the communication skill and insight into other options. Um, for other people, sometimes it's expressing or allowing themselves to have an outlet to express or feel extreme levels of intense emotions. Or it makes it manageable, it distracts, it takes a little bit away from that feeling. Um, and then there are times where sometimes it is used as manipulation, a means to again get something that person needs or isn't getting in an otherwise healthy way. Um, so that's again not to demonize or to kind of tear down a person who is self-harming, but rather there's some function behind that behavior, and it usually we see that again in if that person has a deficit of communication skill and coping skills, or they just don't have certain abilities or resources available to them. At the end of the day, a lot of times this is about getting relief. When a person self injures, there is an endorphin release, and there can be a sense of relief. Giving a person, distracting them from an intense emotion, distracting from maybe being in the middle of a traumatic experience, maybe ongoing, domestic abuse in the house, whatever. Getting away from that can be relief for that individual. It's not a healthy way, right? But it is serving a function. So finding healthier means to address that, to change those issues, that's kind of what the psych and therapy process is about, is giving people different tools to empower themselves to heal and to cope in a more productive manner. But we still respect that basic action, that basic a person who doesn't have other options or cannot see those other options, or maybe grew up in an environment where they don't have other tools that were taught to them. People are going to use what they need to use in order to get through. And that's not a fault, that's not a character flaw. But when we recognize that and there's the option for healing, then we respect that past behavior and then say, hey, maybe it's time that we retire that and find a different way. Um, some um, some people may not get the same impact as others when they self harm. So, if one person is saying, I'm finding benefit from this maladaptive behavior, and the other person's like, whoa, hey, that does nothing for me. That makes me more anxious. Well, once again, everybody's different, and we're all wired a little differently. So just keep that in mind too. If you have a tough time, if you're ever reading, stories of people in the recovery process, or media portrayals, or interviews, any of that kind of stuff, and it's difficult to, understand, just keep that in mind that everybody is wired a little bit differently and have different impacts. So treatment process for some of this. If a person were to seek therapy, a lot of times we would be focusing on what we call cognitive behavioral approaches, and dialectical behavior approaches. Um, A specific one of those would be habit reversal training. Essentially, what we do is we build insight as to the how, the why, what's the benefit, what's the cost, do some motivational interviewing in that aspect, and then we work on replacing behaviors. Because it's not enough to just say, hey, that behavior is bad and unhealthy and wrong, right? Doesn't help, doesn't give you any benefit, and it doesn't give any sense of direction for that person in what they can do that would be healthy and helpful and still get that same benefit, right? So, habit reversal training kind of looks at um, what what can we do instead, and what ways can we kind of delay the response of these kind of harmful actions. Um, so things like grounding, mindfulness. For those of you that were in class when we did 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, that's another grounding exercise. Mindfulness, taking in your sensory data, letting that be a way to ground yourself, distract, and kind of let the feeling quell. All feelings, thoughts are kind of transient, they're passing. So if we can slow down that impulse, if we can kind of get that person through the moment a little bit, that can help. But also to give them a different skill. So like for some people, what has worked is like if they have problems with like cutting, some people have where you have a rubber band or a bracelet on the wrist, and they kind of fiddle with that just to give something to do. Um, in terms of hair pulling, one thing that's been done and suggested as a reversal, as a replacement, is a fuzzy stuffed animal just to kind of pick at and play with until some of these other healthy coping skills can be brought in, can be mastered and addressed. So sometimes it's simply we're looking for that replacement as kind of a stopgap. Um, the other thing is we have kind of a harm reduction viewpoint too. So for those of you that were in class when we talked about substance use, harm reduction is all about okay, we can't necessarily replace the behavior. We can't completely get rid of it in one setting. Maybe the person doesn't have a structural ability for change. Maybe they're living in a very impoverished network where some of what they would need to be able to help them out isn't there. But what can we do to kind of make things safer for that person? So, like a harm reduction viewpoint with self harm would be looking at, if the person's cutting or burning, what kind of access, what kind of skills do they have for treating the wounds? Do they know that, risk of infection is a possibility? Do they know who to ask for help? Or are there caretakers? Are there care team, family involved at all? Is there any way that we can get those folks involved to just kind of help keep an extra pair of eyes, make the process safer? At the end of the day, it's always about safety, always the number one priority. So, once again, none of what we're going over here in this short lecture is anything meant to be exhausted. Again, not meant to replace an actual exam or medical information. This is just lecture information. So always consult your physician, your therapist, any of your professionals in your care circle. Um, and if it's an emergency, always go ER 911. So then we're gonna switch gears a little bit here, talking more directly about suicide itself. And a couple things with this, just to start off with, is even using the language. There's different ways and different philosophies about talking about it. What's more correct, what's considered to be less harmful, less judging. And to be quite frank, I'm not 100% sure what is the right way. So often when I'm meeting with people, when I'm talking with others, if they have direct experience, whether they've attempted themselves or other people in their lives have, um, I always let that guide me. I it's not my necessarily my place to to come up with that language and change other people's language. So that's how I'm going to go about it. If I phrase something and it rubs you the wrong way, email me after you get done watching this, and let's chat about it. Um, because I've found, and not just in this topic, but every topic in psychology, that there are certain ways that's just going to rub somebody the wrong way, or it's not going to feel quite right. And everybody has their unique definitions, interpretations, and perspectives. So keep that open communication with this, okay? Um, so once again, suicide actions with with the intent of fatality, or at least the possibility of fatality. Um, the There is different language with it. If you Some people say if a person succeeds and does kill themselves, some people say they completed suicide. Some people say they committed suicide. Means the same thing, just has, once again, different interpretations and feelings attached to those. Um, in the reading I gave, one of the readings I gave you had the acronym Is Path Warm? It's a mnemonic acronym for, the various risk factors, different things to ask to get a feeling for, the safety of that person, and the risk factors, the likelihood of outcomes. Um, Sometimes it's criticized as being overly simplistic or not effective enough. And one thing to keep in mind with anything, whether we're talking about, suicide, anxiety, self harm, depression, any of that stuff, these things are just a tool. They're never going to be perfect. They're never going to be 100%. If they help to at least guide and give a little bit of that extra information, then in my book, I think they're succeeding. There was one study done that tried to test this acronym by trying to see if it could determine if it would help a therapist determine the difference between a fake suicide note and a real suicide note, and it didn't seem to make any difference. And to me, that's not as important. The importance was in that study that it showed that it did help the therapist catch it when that was present in the narrative. Um, so once again, none of these things that we've given you throughout the semester will ever be 100% effective for screening, but it can help. And the idea is we do the best we can. The human brain, the human mind, our psychology, it's a complex thing. So if you see any of the criticism on that, take it with a grain of salt, and just think, if you've got a friend or loved one in front of you, what do you think is going to be helpful if you need to have that tough conversation? Um, so then, suicide is, once again, another complex thing. It can be something that a person has contemplated for a long time, has planned out for a long time. Maybe they do give out notes, redo their will, and start handing out possessions in a very ordered fashion. Um, or it can be a very impulsive thing in the moment. Something hits, whether it's a trauma, a crisis, a great loss, maybe substance use is going on, and maybe they're not thinking clearly in that moment. So it can be impulsive or it can be well thought out. Um, Either way, we look at both risk factors for an individual and protective factors. So once again, those risk factors are going to include things like substance use, or conversely, if that person is going through withdrawal. Use and withdrawal, sometimes they can impact judgment or increase erratic or impulsive behavior, or also it can just contribute to things like anxiety and depression, or put that person, especially if they're in withdrawal, they might be in physical pain, they might be sick. So it adds to that kind of motivation to try and change what's going on. And ultimately, that's what suicide tends to be about, is that change of feeling. Trying to get rid of or change what's going on right now. Sometimes you'll see mood shifts or changes as a risk factor. Have they gone extremely depressed and the next morning seem to be very accepting of the world and um, having a sense of relief? Some night and day differences like that can sometimes be a factor. And with all of these, it's good to know that factors are just that. They're not a guarantee, they're not a permanent, absolute promise of, yes, this person is suicidal or no, they aren't. But they're things that we look at to try and gauge and make, the best choices that we can to try and help other people. Try to see if, if I've got a friend next to me who's struggling, if I've got a family member, do I need to call 911? Do I need to call the crisis line? So, once again, factors are just that. They're not guarantees. We also look at things like access to means. Does the person have a viable way to kill themselves or hurt themselves? Guns tend to be the biggest risk factor. Simply put, they're lethal. That's what they're meant to do, is be lethal. Now, I'm not going to go into any debate about gun control, but what we know from research, what we know from outcomes, is that guns are a very big red flag risk factor. Um, Other means would be including things like, does the person have knives, whether that's kitchen knives, hunting knives, depending on the situation that might need to be removed. What about their medications? Any history of misuse of that? Or if the person's really impulsive, or if they've got a little bit of cognitive disability, is somebody else helping them take their meds, or have they been left in charge of that? And do we need to maybe replace that so that another person helps them out, at least in the short term, to kind of ensure some safety? Um, what actions are they taking when they're getting behind the wheel? Are they being impulsive? Are they speeding? Are they taking a lot of risks? Other aspects we look at are actual planning. Is this person indicating or appearing to make plans? Are they openly talking about how they would do it, or if they were another person, maybe they're working through proxy? Is that present in their narrative? And then we look at the ideation too. And there's kind of two different forms of ideation with suicide. One we would say is active ideation, where they're directly thinking of committing suicide. They're directly thinking about how they would do it, what that would look like, what that would feel like. If they're directly saying, I, want to kill myself, or if that's part of it. Sometimes you'll find that people have passive ideation, and that's something like thinking, what would it be like if I wasn't here? What would it be? I wonder what, maybe what other people would be doing. That stuff that's just not, it's not direct. Um, and then we also look at other symptoms of what's going on. What's their depression been like? What's the anxiety been like? Manic. If do they have any manner of, you know, paranoid thought or delusional thought, hallucination stuff where it's indicating self harm, or it's got some level of content where maybe a person's hearing a voice telling, being disparaging. So that can be a risk factor, but once again, not a guarantee. So if a person, for instance, has bipolar and is currently experiencing a manic episode, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to hurt themselves or commit suicide. But it's just something to look out for. Um, Protective factors include things like, what's their support system? Do they have a lot of friends that they can talk to? Do they have a supportive family? Is their network willing to bring them to appointments? If they're not if they're not well, do they have somebody that's willing to stay with them at home if they can't get into the hospital or be seen by a therapist? Um, or is their support system saying that they're willing and able to call 911 if need be? Are they willing to go into the house, remove means of harm, or just otherwise be there for that individual? That's a huge factor. Willingness the individual in question. Another protective factor is their willingness to engage with their care team, with the people around them, and speak honestly about this. Um, are they willing to sit down and do some safety planning? Are they, if one of the things as part of that safety plan is to remove the means of harm, are they willing to do that? Are they willing to have a family member vouch for that? Um, Another aspect is if that individual has commitments or forward thinking plans that are positive. So things like, are they saying they want to go back to work? Do they want to go to certain social functions, family functions? Are they saying they want to be there for family? That kind of stuff. That's always a good sign. Um, and again, none of this is all solid. There's no guarantee with any of this, but they are factors. Another thing that sometimes gets thrown around in terms of factors are going to be things like certain populations, and you have to take how it's phrased with a grain of salt. So, for instance, there's a higher rate of self harm and suicide in the GLBT community. Now, that doesn't say that if you identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer, any of that, it's not saying that you're predisposed to be more likely to commit suicide or to have an episode of self harm. But what it's saying is there are a lot of cultural factors and social factors that add unique stressors that raise the difficulty for people coming from those backgrounds. And it's cultural, it's external to themselves. So if you see statements like that, if you see data like that, keep that in mind that it's not an inherent value of people from that group, but rather it's an expression of some of those cultural symptoms, maybe stigma, bias, discrimination, all of that. So keep that in mind. Um, Men are more likely to complete suicide, and women are more likely to attempt it, or tend to attempt it more. The rates are higher. Um, and once again, that's another one of these statements and data sets that are more, it's a cultural thing, it's not a biologic predisposition. Um, if you do any level of research in this, if you do any reading with this, and you run across stuff talking about safety contracts, those are when, if a person's experiencing suicidal ideation, that they sign a contract with their therapist, their doctor, whoever, saying that they will not go out and hurt themselves. There's no evidence showing that that has an impact on the outcomes one way or another, good or bad. But they are an opportunity to work with general safety planning with that person and their family if present, to go through and provide different resources, get them to kind of plan out, all right, if I'm having this thought, if I'm having this feeling, who can I call? What coping skill can I do? Where can I go? And make that more available. So that's kind of one of those times where the the primary thing doesn't really have an impact, but it gives an opportunity to help out. Um, and once again, all thoughts, feelings, and impulses are temporary. Um, Often we try to help get the person to make it through that moment until that thought, that feeling, that impulse passes, and then we can start to work on some of those underlying issues. So it's important that that feeling, that thought, it will pass. A person is not going to remain in that state of mind 24/7 for the rest of their life. Past attempts, past thoughts are not a guarantee or a promise that that person will try again in the future. So if that's happened in the past and the person's been doing well, it's okay to have some trust in that. It becomes a risk factor in the future if they start to feel down again, but it's not a guarantee that that person's going to suffer those thoughts throughout their whole life. So then, functionality of suicide often is to escape suffering, escape trauma, try to once again get to something where they're experiencing or feeling something different or better. That tends to be the core of it. Um, Substance use and overdose does not always indicate that the person's trying to commit suicide or wants to die or even wants to self harm. So keep that in mind. Is that overdose? Sometimes they are a pure accident. Sometimes whatever substance they're using is tainted. Um, it's an area where context matters. Same thing with self harm and substance use. Keep in mind that kind of the functionality of it and the intent kind of determine whether we would consider that to be self harm or not. Um, what what should you do if somebody you think is going to commit suicide? First of all, keep calm. It's scary. It's frightening. It's terrifying. But do your best to keep calm. Keep them talking. And it's okay to ask in direct language. Are you thinking of suicide? Are you thinking of hurting yourself? Are you thinking of killing yourself? Do you have a plan? If you have a plan, what is it? Asking for details like that, it will never encourage a person to commit suicide. It will never help them figure it out. And it's truly one of the only ways that you can have any level of certainty that that's present. If you don't ask, sometimes you'll never know. So know that it's okay to ask those questions and it will not do harm. As long as you're asking it in a neutral, non-judgmental way. If you're insulting, if you're judging, but just be direct. If you feel that person's at risk of hurting themselves, don't leave them alone. And if there's immediate threat, if it's imminent, call 911 and give as much information as you can. Let that operator know that this person's having a mental health crisis, and once again, avoid using judging or threatening language. If you have to call 911 to get that person to the hospital, they may be upset with you, they may be angry with you, but keep in mind that you are doing the right thing. And it may hurt, it may suck in the moment. That's a clinical phrase right there. But sometimes that's what you have to do to keep a person safe. If they're willing to go with you, in some cases, so you can bring that person to the hospital directly, to the ER. If you do that, make sure that you walk into the building with them and that you see that they are being taken care of by staff. That way you just ensure that that person just doesn't go out another exit in the building. So make sure that you witness that person being for lack of better terms handed off to medical professionals and is in their care. Again, safety is always important here. If you get in touch with that person's therapist or doctor, whoever, and part of their safety planning is to remove the means, then if you can help out with that process, if you're willing to sit in appointments with that person, sometimes that can help. It can be frightening for both you and that person, and sometimes they need that extra support in their assessments and their therapy meetings. And if it's something that they're open to, or if it's something you're willing to offer, sometimes that can help. And at the end of the day, if somebody does fall through and complete suicide, know that it isn't your fault. It will hurt, but know that at some level that is the choice that individual made, and that it's not your fault, and sometimes it happens. If that does go through, make sure you talk with a crisis counselor, a therapist, or somebody you trust and work through those feelings. Now, by no means, again, is this exhaustive list of risk factors, of ways of treating, of research for self-harm and suicide. It's just meant to be a little brief introductory for some of the readings that you guys have done. It's important that when you go through this, if you do have any strong feelings, to get in touch with, if you have your own personal therapist or doctor, get in touch with them, or HCC. Donna Gredham, Jillian Rustow, and Student Services are the therapists for the campus, and they are still working with people. You can email them, you can call them, and I believe they have it set up that you can do appointments through Zoom. And once again, anytime there's a direct imminent emergency, dial 911, report to your local ER. If it's not quite that level, call the local crisis line. Once again, if you have any questions on the material or if you need any clarification, shoot me an email. And Fridays, noon to 2, I'm going to try and have an open office Zoom thing set up. And details will be in D2L later on this week with how to do that. So thanks for sitting through. And once again, if you have any questions, send me a line. Otherwise, I will see y'all next week.